Awesome. All right. So where we're going to pick up is where we left off last week, because that's probably the best place to do it. And where we're going to be starting is in Bill's story. And we're on page 8. And just for those that are joining this week for the first time, hey, welcome. We were just talking about you. I mean, a lot earlier, not just right now. Welcome. Glad you're here. Sorry, I won't do that with everyone. Although I do like doing that when I'm at a meeting and people come in late. I'm like, hey, we were just talking about you. Oh, why am I like this? Anywho, so page 8. And what has happened up to this point is Bill Wilson, we've seen the progression of his illness. We've seen his lack of control and his lack of choice, the physical allergy and the mental obsession. And we see him go to the town's hospital and he learned what his problem was and he relapsed. And he goes back to the town's hospital and he learns that he's going to die of this illness. And then he relapses. And where we pick up is at the very bottom paragraph, not the very bottom paragraph, but the paragraph that starts near the end of that bleak November. So near the end of that November that felt absolutely and utterly hopeless for him. He says, I sat drinking in my kitchen. With a certain satisfaction, I reflected that there was enough gin concealed about the house to carry me through that night and the next day. My wife was at work. I wondered whether I dared hide a full bottle of gin near the head of our bed. I would need it before daylight. I don't know about you, but I was hiding things. I was hiding bottles. I was hiding like drugs. I had a stash here and there. And actually, I don't know if I shared this last week, but it was a number of years ago. I saw that like right behind the toilet at my mom's room, she had like put this like bottle of wine, and I just took notice of that because I thought that's an interesting place, and I just went to ask her about it, and she was like, "Oh, I was gonna hide it in the toilet tank, and it wouldn't fit." And I'm like, 1, toilet tank, amateur hour. 2, girl, I have been sober. I've been sober a while. And like I am free. Like the obsession is removed. You don't need to hide bottles of anything. But regardless, I mean, what I will say is a slight advantage to the toilet tank is it stays a little bit cold. So anywho, I had hiding places, but it wasn't the toilet tank. All right. So it says my musing was interrupted by the telephone. The cheery voice of an old school friend asked if he might come over. And if you're writing in your book today, you can make a little note if you don't already have it that this is Ebby Thatcher, Ebby, and Thatcher is Tatcher. And we're going to do a bit of review of history, but we're not going to do it right away. But for those that maybe remember that Ebby Thatcher is going to bring some very, very important information to Bill Wilson. And then it says, top of page 9, he was sober. He was sober. Now, I want to point something out. Whenever we see italics in this book, I mean, italics in any book is important, right? But in this book specifically, italics are important because back in the 1930s, when this book was printed, you couldn't hit Control-I or Command-I. Some of you, I just taught you a little hack on Microsoft Word, but you couldn't hit Control-I and just get italics. You actually had to pay for the font to be changed. So what that means is if there is anything in this book that is in italics, about 100 or so drunks needed to agree that it was a good enough idea to spend money on it. If you don't know what a miracle that is, I encourage you to go to your home group and make a motion to spend some money and see the fireworks go. You know, again, if you're missing the chaos of active alcoholism or active addiction, just get involved in your home group and make a couple motions. It'll start happening for you. So he was sober. So what we're saying is there's something absolutely remarkable about Ebby Thatcher showing up sober. It says it was years since I could remember his coming to New York in that condition, the condition of sobriety. Oh, so we're starting to get a picture, right? I was amazed. Rumor had it. And anytime I say rumor had it, I think of that song that goes, rumor had it. But that's the only words of the song that I know. And that stays in my brain forever. And I just wanted to share that misery with you guys. but rumor had it that he had been committed for alcoholic insanity. So the rumor was that Abby Thatcher had been locked up as the result of his drinking. And then Bill Wilson says, I wondered how he had escaped. You know, and the thing is with him, I wonder how he had escaped. Listen, how I imagine Bill Wilson is imagining this is like, Bill Wilson's like, I wonder if he tied his bed sheets together and shimmied out the window. Like, that's how I imagine it. What he probably means is, I wonder how he got out of that mess. So that's great. But I like the bed sheet metaphor. And just welcome if you're joining us. We're on page 9. And so it says, of course, he would have dinner, and then I could drink openly with him. Unmindful of his welfare, I thought only of recapturing the spirit of other days. There was a time that we had chartered an airplane to complete a jag. A jag is just like a spree, like a bender. His coming was an oasis in this dreary desert of futility. The very thing, an oasis. Drinkers are like this, or like that, and him describing it as an oasis. Man, oftentimes I describe my alcoholism in a number of ways, and my addiction in a number of ways. One of it is being lost in the desert. You know, that hopelessness of being lost in the desert and there's no way out. And, you know, I would read Bill's story for a long time, and I'm like, who cares that you got an airplane, some hoity-toity drunk? I don't relate to this. What does this have to do with anything? Well, in this small paragraph, what Bill Wilson is trying to do is qualify Abby Thatcher as an alcoholic. So he's trying to do what Bill Wilson has done for 8 pages in one short little paragraph. And there's a story, and I don't think it's true, but never let the truth get in the way of a good story. But the story is that Bill Wilson would say, man, if I ever get as bad a drunk as Abby, I know I'll quit. And that's what we're trying to convey, the information that Abby Thatcher is also a hopeless alcoholic. And I always, when I'm in Bill's story, I always like to pop over to Lois Remembers, because I'm going to read the story about what happened with that airplane. Because for me, I can't relate to chartering an airplane to complete a jag. I was not that sort of drinker. I was not a high ball, sort of high roller sort of person. I was a low ball, low stakes sort of hopeless drunk. But you know, there's some information in the story if we take a second look. And so this is on Lois Remembers. If you don't have Lois Remembers, goodness, you don't need to. But if you do, it happens to be on page 76. And it says, whenever his work took him near Albany, Bill would stop in to see his old friend Abby. And they always got drunk together. Ever have a buddy like that, you know? On one of these sprees, a brilliant idea hit them. Abby had heard that a new airfield was about to be opened by the Equinox House in Manchester, Vermont. So it was the opening of a brand new airport. They hired a plane. They wired the time of arrival to Miss Orvis, the owner of the hotel, and stocked up well for the flight. If you're wondering what stocked up well means, they got a bunch of booze. That's what that means. They were stocked up well. And it says this was a gala day for Manchester. Like, this is a big deal for the city of Manchester, Vermont. Miss Orvis called out the band to greet the first plane to arrive at the new airport. Guys, there's a band. There is a full-on, imagine like a marching band, trombones and tambourines, like, uh-oh, guys. And it says, and the town fathers all gathered at the airfield. So the town fathers, anyone who's anyone, everyone of status and importance is here at the airfield to celebrate its grand opening. It says the plane flew in. The band played lustily. The welcoming committee got ready. And Bill and Abby stepped down from the plane and fell flat on their faces, dead drunk. And here's what I can say. I don't relate to get my own private airplane to complete a jag, but I do know what it's like to show up to an important event. Absolutely so hammered or so loaded or so blacked out that I ruin the whole thing. I know what it's like to ruin family events and family holidays. This was when I was acquainted with ruining or not showing up for, you know? And so back to Bill's story, page 9. And so when he talks about Ebby Thatcher being this oasis, man, across the page, we see Bill Wilson on page 8. It's his step one experience, that loneliness, the despair, the self-pity, which is quicksand all around him, that desert which has taken him. But his friend come and they can recapture some of the memories of old days, that old drinking buddy. It feels like this oasis in the desert. And it says the door opened and he stood there, fresh-skinned and glowing. There was something about his eyes. He was inexplicably different. What had happened? And so what's incredible about that is Ebby Thatcher has carried a message. He has carried a message of depth and weight. He's demonstrated that there is a change that has happened in him, and he hasn't even opened his mouth. You know, it's one of those things that I really believe that my responsibility to the newcomer, my responsibility to the alcoholic or the addict who still suffers is to live in such a way where my deportment shouts that there's an answer. My job isn't to show up and be like, keep coming back. Don't take the first, my job is to show up, demonstrating the change that has happened to me. So you can't deny that something has happened to Paige, and maybe you get a little curious about it, to demonstrate this power, not to tell you necessarily what you need to do, but to share with you what I have done. That's my job. And man, I'm not going to carry a message if I'm full of misery, And so I pushed a drink. We're on page 9, middle of the page for those that just joined. It says, I pushed a drink across the table. He refused it. Disappointed, but curious, I wondered what had gotten into the fellow. He wasn't himself. You know what himself would be? Drinking it. He said no to drinking. What is this? Who is this stranger before me? What's all this about? I queried. And so the power of this program, that light that is on in his eyes, that hope that is undeniable, that is in his face, and his restoration to sanity, he does not want to drink. That carries enough of a message for Bill Wilson to be curious. What's all this about? You're not yourself. Why aren't you drinking? And he says, he looked straight at me. Simply, but smilingly, he said, I've got religion. And so what Ebby Thatcher is talking about when he says, I've got religion, Ebby Thatcher is a member of the Oxford movement, the Oxford group, and we're going to talk about that here in a little bit. But the Oxford group had nothing to do with not drinking, but it had everything to do with the deeper experience of God. So the Oxford group happens to be religious. 12-step groups aren't religious. And if you are religious, amazing, wonderful. If you're not, amazing, wonderful. All of that is okay here in 12-step. But Bill Wilson, again, page 8, no words can tell of the loneliness and despair. He is overwhelmed. Alcohol is his master. He is as beaten down by this illness as one can be, beaten and broken. He's told that, and he sees the hope that is on in Ebby Thatcher's eyes. He sees that this is a man who has been restored to a sanity that he knows nothing about. So this is Bill Wilson's open-minded response. I was aghast. What? That sort of reaction. So that was it. Last summer, an alcoholic crackpot. Now I suspected a little cracked about religion. He had that starry-eyed look. Yes, the old boy was on fire, all right, but bless his heart. Let him rant. Besides, my gin would last longer than his preaching. And you know what I love? I love that Bill Wilson, he's desperate, he's dying, and immediately, he closes his mind to the miracle that lies before him. And I want to be quite frank with you, I've done that. When I was miserable, and I mean miserable, when my skin doesn't fit and I was sober and not doing this thing, doing maybe some of it, but I wasn't doing all of it. The people who were full of joy, the people that had the light on in their eyes, man, I couldn't stand them. They were annoying. Now I'm aware I'm one of those annoying ones now, but they were annoying. And I would just, I'm like, oh, they're so full of themselves. They're so egotistical. They're so arrogant. No, they just didn't hate themselves to the level that I did. You know what I'm saying? And so how easy it is for me to dismiss, even in the rooms, the miracle that I see before me. And I also love bless his heart. So for you, those of you that are in the South, you guys know bless his heart is not a compliment, which I wish it was, because doesn't it sound lovely on the face of it? You know, bless his heart, his heart to be blessed. It's so wonderful. It is quite condescending, which a modern day, or at least a 12-step equivalent, could be keep coming back. On the face of it, it sounds lovely. But I don't know about you. There's been times I've probably said the stupidest thing I've ever thought, and somebody followed it with, keep coming back, Paige. You know what I mean? It's got a condescending edge to it. And I have this thing with sponsees where we joke about, keep coming back, you sweet summer child. Just with some of my sponsees where we know we're joking. I wouldn't say that to anyone else. So I just love that. And it says, but he did no ranting. In a matter-of-fact way, he told how two men had appeared in court persuading the judge to suspend his commitment. They had told of a simple religious idea. And that simple religious idea is our solution. And that's a spiritual awakening. Simply put, that is it possible God or a higher power is bigger than my alcoholism? Spiritual experience, spiritual awakening, that is our solution. And it says a practical program of action. And what today, our practical program of action, adapted from the actions and directions of the Oxford group, has become our 12 steps. And so in this moment, Bill Wilson has the 3 pieces of information that we need to know in order to stay sober. He knows what his problem is. He was hospitalized twice in the town's hospital, where he sat with Dr. Silkworth, who told him, man, he didn't say man or dude, but sometimes I throw that in. Dude, you've got a physical allergy. You can't drink like normal people. Once you start, you can't stop. And he's like, man, and you also have this mental obsession. The will is amazingly weakened when it comes to combating liquor. You're going to drink again. And he also learned the nature of his illness is that it was hopeless. He learned from his second hospitalization that he was going to die of this thing. So he knew of his problem. And in this moment, he's got the problem, he's got the solution, he's got the program of action. And I'm just going to do a little bit of history review, because maybe it might be a little bit helpful, and just seeing how this all ties in together. And so when we talk about, what happened here, the 2 men who came and visited him in court, like what happened? And so where our story begins for some of the history review is on page 26. I'm going to see if I can just make it a little bit bigger. Woo. It's the thing, it landed right there. We go, hold on. Whoop. And then there we go. That's a little bit bigger. Hopefully it makes it more legible for you guys. And so what happened is Roland Hazard, and he's the gentleman on page 26. And on page 26, Roland Hazard, he's the super wealthy American businessman. He comes from a good family, a good home, but he can't stay sober. And he goes and sees every doctor and psychiatrist, the best of the best of the best that the United States has to offer. And he can't stay sober. And he has to slum it and go over to Europe and see the second best psychiatrist in the world. And I kind of make that joke because Roland Hazard, he wanted to work with Dr. Sigmund Freud, probably one of the most famous psychiatrists in the world. But, we get our first break because Freud was busy. Being so famous and well-known, he was busy. So he had to slum it and stick with his second choice. And isn't that interesting? Because the spiritual awakening seems to always begin with us not getting what we want, right? I don't get what I want, but as a result, I get what I need. So Roland Hazard, he works one-on-one with Carl Jung for a year. And he works intensively. He feels like even though he had relapsed every single other time he had done treatment or saw a psychiatrist, he felt really good. He had self-knowledge, just like Bill did. He knows himself. But on his way back to the United States, he stops off in France and goes on a bender. And he goes back to Carl Jung and he says, dude, What the heck? Do you not see how expensive you are? It was a year. I worked with you. And I got drunk again? What the heck, dude? And Carl Jung says, I'm sorry I misdiagnosed you. You have the mind of a chronic alcoholic, and people like you do not recover. So Roland Hazard has this moment of hopelessness. And he says, is there no exceptions? And Carl Jung says, yes, there are exceptions to cases such as yours have been occurring here and there once in a while. Alcoholics have had what are called vital spiritual experiences. And he describes them as they're phenomenon. It's where these ideas, emotions, and attitudes, which were once the guiding forces of our lives, are suddenly cast to one side, and a completely new set of conceptions begin to dominate them. So how I was showing up, how I was living my life, the attitudes, my emotions, my actions, all of that very suddenly gets changed and rearranged to something completely new. What you need, Roland Hazard, is a spiritual awakening. You need a spiritual experience. But the odds of this thing happening to you are like the odds of you getting struck by lightning. You can't hang around a church pew and hope it happens for you. You've got to go out and seek it and find it. And what was growing in popularity at this time was a group known as the Oxford Group. And they grew in popularity in Oxford University. And they were a religious organization. And their sole purpose was having a deeper experience of the God of their understanding. And they had a series of actions that any human being could take to have a deeper experience of God. And Roland Hazard's like, hey, I need one of those, or I'm going to drink again. And so he gets so armed with the knowledge of what the solution is. He gets involved with the Oxford Group and takes that course of action, what later becomes our 12 steps, and is armed with knowledge of what the program of action is. And as a result of taking those actions, he's able to stay sober. And he's staying sober, and you know, he's a wealthy guy, so he's going to summer in Vermont. You know what I mean? He's going to visit his summer home. He's flying in. He's hoity-toity. You know, he didn't charter the airplane to complete a jag, but maybe he chartered the airplane to complete some, I was going to say God's business. You know, that idea, God's about his business, because it's a miracle. Because if you think about it, if he shows up a week earlier or a week later, maybe we're not here. You know what I mean? Maybe we're not sober. Maybe the connections don't get made. And so Abby Thatcher, our intrepid hero of Bill's story, who brought the knowledge to Bill. Well, Abby Thatcher, this handsome fella. Whenever I do the history, I like to call them all handsome fellas. You can imagine if they were on Tinder, which way you'd swipe. That's for you to do, not for me to do. But Abby Thatcher, what had happened for him is he had gotten into some trouble with the law, and he was looking at a 6-month sentence. And the week he happened to be on trial was the week that Roland Hazard came to visit. And, you know, some of the guys in the Oxford Group were like, you know, Roland, you were able to solve your alcohol problem. Maybe you could help Abby Thatcher. And so he shows up, and he shows up with his friend Shep Cornell and Seba Graves. And Seba Graves was the son of the judge. So the judge presiding over the case was Judge Graves. And why am I mentioning all this? Well, I imagine you guys know, like, Real Housewives. I haven't watched any of the shows, but I can just kind of imagine what it's about. Well, imagine in the 1930s, like the Real Housewives of Manchester, Vermont, or Real Housewives, Vermont, right? There's probably up in everyone's business gossiping about everyone. And so they probably all knew about Roland Hazard's exploits and his troubles and his struggles. And it's reported as saying, as the judge said, only for you, Roland, will I let Abby Thatcher go into your care. He's got to show up sober on Monday. But if he does, we'll let him go and we'll commute his sentence. And, you know, it's one of those things, maybe only for you, Roland, came as the result of, you know, hearing that there had been a change in Roland, that this man who could not stay sober despite all of these things that he tried, he was now sober. So Abby Thatcher, he doesn't want to do 6 months in jail. He maybe doesn't have the best motives. He works the steps and he stays sober. And on page 9, he shows up carrying our solution, a spiritual awakening, and knowledge of the program of action. And Bill Wilson, having met Dr. Silkworth and already got connected, he's got the 3 pieces of information: problem, solution, program of action. And so we'll stop the screen sharing there and keep rocking and rolling. And so for those that just joined, we're on page 9. And so where we left it off is the paragraph where it says he did no ranting. In a matter-of-fact way, he told how two men had appeared in court persuading the judge to suspend his commitment. And this was the line that we jumped off on. It says they had told of a simple religious idea, spiritual awakening, and a practical program of action, what became our 12 steps. And this is important. That was 2 months ago. And the result was self-evident. It worked. He is 2 months sober. 2 months sober. The light is in his eyes, and he's going on essentially a 12-step call. 2 months sober. And really what I want to emphasize for anyone and everyone here today is it does not take long to get well. It does not take long to have a spiritual awakening. It does not take long to be in a place where I'm recovered from that hopeless, seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. And if you are here today and you are struggling, if you've been in and out, if you're new, or if you've been around a little while and the magic is gone, this is so much hope. It does not take long to recover, to have a spiritual awakening. It didn't, our lives, my life, I shouldn't say ours, but if we're hanging out here on a Monday night when there's football on, our lives hung in the balance of somebody carrying this message 2 months sober. And he carried that message. It was a demonstration. 2 months ago, it worked. He could see the change. Not that this guy was, just kind of, don't drink, hold on, don't do it. No, there was a change that he could see that was undeniable. It does not take long. He says he had come to pass his experience along to me if I cared to have it. I was shocked, but interested. And isn't that what I'm just going to kind of talk about something for a little while. Abby Thatcher shows up to Bill Wilson. Well, many times in this book, we're going to talk about it is my responsibility to make the approach the newcomer. And of course, he's not going to push it on him. He's saying, hey, if you want it, he's not doing no preaching. He's not doing no ranting. If you want it, I will help you. And so Bill was shocked, but interested. Certainly I was interested. I had to be, for I was hopeless. Hopeless. For those that have been coming around this study, what we always want to emphasize is a pattern in this book from hopeless to hope. See, if I'm here and I am hopeless, that's actually a perfect place to be. Because when I am hopeless, I am hopefully come to the end of myself, the end of my good ideas, the end of my plans, my little plans and designs, as the book says. And I'm willing to try something that I don't want to do. I'm willing to take actions that I don't think will help. And I'm willing to try another way. That hopeless breeds the hope, from hopeless to hope. And so he had to be, for I was hopeless. And now what we're going to get into in page 10 and 11, and it's going to go on to page 12, is Bill Wilson's wrestling with the idea of the second step. He's wrestling with belief in a power of God. And we're going to see him be open and closed, and open and closed, and open and closed, and open and closed. And we're going to see that wrestle. And we're going to see what closes him off, and we're going to see what opens him up. But I just want to contextualize this, because that's what's going on. Because, I would read this stuff by myself when I was new, and even not that new, and it didn't make sense. Why are we talking about the spheres? And we'll talk about that in a sec, but that's what's happening. He's wrestling. He's having that battle internally with the idea of God. And we can ask ourselves, hey, have I ever had those internal battles? Or I wasn't sure about a power greater than myself, right? So it says he talked for hours. Childhood memories rose before me. I could almost hear the sound of the preacher's voice as I sat on still Sundays way over there on the hillside. So Bill Wilson, he's not in the church. He's sitting on the hill and he's over here. And so I just want to point some out. He's not in the church on Sundays. And it says there was a proffered temperance pledge I never signed. So a temperance pledge was a little like an abstinence pledge for alcohol. Like, I promise I will never drink. You'll take note that Bill Wilson, he didn't sign that. Another equivalent would be those who grew up with the DARE program. I think they made you sign a pledge. I dare to stay off alcohol and drugs. I'm never going to do that, right? Anyone here ever signed that pledge? How well that work? You know what I mean? And then for some that are, if we got some people who are a little bit younger than me, Another equivalent would be like, y'all remember the Jonas Brothers? They had those purity rings where it's like, I'm going to wear this ring. It's a sign that I will not have premarital sex. So like that. It's a promise not to do something. Bill Wilson didn't even bother with the promise. He's like, yeah, I'm not going to do that. And it says, my grandfather's good-natured contempt of some church folks and their doing. And it's this good-natured contempt. He wasn't super open to religion or religious ideas. And Bill Wilson, he was raised by his maternal grandmother and grandfather, but I believe it was his paternal, his father's grandfather, who he's referring to here, because his paternal grandfather was an alcoholic. And his paternal grandfather had this experience where he climbed up to the top. And just let's make a little note that he's climbing to the top of a mountain. Some of you guys knows what's going to happen here. And he had one of those 1 in a million spiritual experiences on a mountaintop. So Bill Wilson's grandfather had an experience of God, an experience of a power greater than himself. And so his grandfather is going to be dismissing a lot of, what he was hearing with some of the organized religion, because it wasn't his experience, but he had an experience to fall back upon. And so that's what we're kind of talking about here. And he says his insistence that the spheres really had their music, but his denial of the preacher's right to tell him how he must listen. So his belief that there is something out there in the universe, but I'm not going to listen or believe in the way that necessarily you believe. That's what it means. But in a very literal sense, the spheres having their music was a theory that as the planets orbited and rotated around in orbit and around the sun, they made an audible noise. And it turns out that is true. So you can go on YouTube. I won't play it because it's awful. And you can listen to planets. They're not all awful, but you can listen to the sound of the planets. But listen, we're coming up to Halloween. We're coming up to spooky season. Woo! So if you just want to give yourself a fright, just listen to the sound of Saturn. It's terrifying. Sorry, this is an absolute tangent, but yeah, just if you're wanting to scare yourself or scare other people, you just play the sound of Saturn. It's got its music. I don't need to listen to it though. And it says his fearlessness as he spoke of these things just before he died. At that moment, those moments before death where, it might be, and understandably so, wanting to reach for some form of spiritual comfort. He stood firm. His grandfather stood firm. I believe what I believe. I don't need to, have last rites for this or that. No, I believe what I believe. And so Bill Wilson's experience with his grandfather is kind of what keeps him closed to organized religion. This is where he's closed. We're going to see him open up for just a glimmer here in a moment. It says that wartime day in old Winchester Cathedral came back. So back on page 1, there are 2 things that happen. On page 1, he's sitting in this beautiful cathedral in England, and it says much moved. And when it says much moved, what we're referencing is Bill Wilson had a spiritual experience in that cathedral. He had this moment where he felt the presence of a power greater than himself. So what's opening him up but his own experience to a power greater than himself? But also, you'll know, our happy-go-lucky drunk, he, after having this experience of the presence of God, wanders outside to the graveyard to take a stroll, as one does. And he sees this tombstone. And whose name is on the tombstone? Well, if we go back to page 1, we can see the name was Thomas Thetcher. For those who are coming, we made that note in the book, Thomas Thetcher. And that tombstone, of all the tombstones, caught his attention, caught his eye. Well, because he had a childhood friend whose name was Ebby Thatcher. So it's Thomas Thetcher, Thetcher, and Ebby Thatcher, Thatcher. And it's one of those things when, I don't know about you, but I can't ignore the power that is some of the synchronicity and the miracles that were happening in our history. And that's why I love it. I get excited about, and I love the myths of our history and the truths of our history. I love it all because I can't deny the power of God in it. So what opens him up? Experience. Experience is what opens him up just a little bit to belief. And here is what Bill Wilson believes. Here's what he's open to. He said, I'd always believed in a power greater than myself. I'd often pondered these things, and I want to point out that capital P, power. And whenever we see, not all the words, but most of the words we see capitalized, they are synonyms. So words that we can use instead of God, but also words that are pointing to that idea of God or a higher power or creator or spirit of the universe. That's what we're pointing to. So it says, I'd often pondered these things. I was not an atheist. Few people really are, for that means blind faith, which is to say that it requires faith to have atheism, right? Faith is involved. For that means blind faith in the strange proposition that this universe originated in a cipher and aimlessly rushes nowhere. My intellectual heroes, the chemists, the astronomers, even the evolutionists suggested vast laws and forces at work. Despite contrary indications, I had little doubt that a mighty purpose and rhythm underlay all. How could there be so much precise and immutable law and no intelligence? I simply had to, no worries, thank you for coming. I simply had to believe in a capital S, capital U, spirit of the universe, who knew neither time nor limitation, but that was as far as I'd gone. And what we're talking about here is he's open to the God of science. That idea of it's autumn right now, and the leaves in the northern hemisphere, it's autumn right now, and the leaves are beginning to change, and that happens every single time around this year, I'm getting into some random sciencey stuff, but the leaves on trees, they tend to grow based on the Fibonacci number pattern, so that the leaves don't grow over themselves. And if I were to take my hulls and I were to drop my hulls from the same height, I normally grab my phone, but my phone was on the wrong side. If I grab anything, my phone or my hulls, and I drop it from the same height, it will fall, and at the same rate every single time. Phone won't last too long if I keep doing that, though. But what he's saying is, like, there's this. I take 2 hydrogen atoms and I add an oxygen, and every single time I get a water molecule. There are these laws and forces at work. How could there be nothing behind that? And so that is what he is open to. And we're seeing that opening crack open a little bit and a little bit and a little bit more. And it says, with ministers in the world's religions, I parted right there. Boom, he's getting closed again. When I talked of a God personal to me, who is love, superhuman strength and direction, I became irritated and my mind snapped shut against such a theory. And many of us come to 12-step rooms and kind of a lot of what a common thing that I hear is like, man, I don't know if I can believe in the bearded guy in the sky. Almost Santa Claus, one that's going to judge me if I'm good and punish me if I'm bad, and a distant God. And it's that idea, and it's like that belief is not something that works for me. And what we're going to find out is that is okay. And here's kind of the thing is, if that is your belief, that is okay. And if it's not, that is okay. That's what we're talking about here. And because the Oxford group was Christian in its purpose, again, he's getting close. So it says, to Christ I conceded the certainty of a great man, not too closely followed by those who claimed him. And you'll notice, and I'm sure this is something that none of us can relate to, but Bill Wilson is absolutely in the gutter and he's judging. Anyway, I'm sure it's just me, but finding myself in the absolute gutter and pits of despair and judging others and how they're doing things. Yeah, that's me. And it says, his moral teaching, most excellent. For myself, I had adopted those parts which seemed convenient and not too difficult. The rest I disregarded, picking and choosing the stuff that's easy to do. What I will say is that doesn't work in 12 steps. That doesn't work here. I can't work these steps buffet style. I got to do all of it, and I got to dive in. I can't pick and choose. And so now what we're getting into is it's a paragraph of that question of, if there is a God, why? If there is a God, why is there pain? If there is a God, why is there suffering? Well, if there is a God, why is there just some of the awfuls that we see in this world? Why? And Bill Wilson, that's a question he's asking. We're starting to see him get closed and closed and closed. And it says the wars which had been fought, the burnings and chicanery is that trickery for personal gain, like that intentional deceit to get my way, that manipulation that religious dispute had facilitated, had created, made me sick. So he saw the results of religious wars and violence and how awful it was. And he says, I honestly doubted whether on balance the religions of mankind had done any good, judging from what I had seen in Europe and since. And when he's talking about what he saw in Europe, he wasn't talking about a gap year where he was backpacking. We're joking about at the start of the meeting about backpacking through Ontario. But he was not having a backpack year. What he was doing was he was involved in the First World War. Now, Bill Wilson did not see frontline combat, but he would have not been, he would have been very well and was very well aware of the horrors of those who saw frontline combat. And the First World War, if you don't know, that was that first war where chemical warfare was used and gas was used and killing absolutely indiscriminately. And these men were fighting in these trenches and hundreds and thousands were dying for not even an inch of land. You know, just the horrors. And there was a level of PTSD known as shell shock that they hadn't seen before. And it was just horrific. And he's like, where is God in that? And it says, so what I'd seen in Europe, the power of God in human affairs was negligible. The capital B, capital M, brotherhood of man, a grim jest. So what that means is humanity, it's a sick joke. And if there was a devil, capital D, he's seen capital B, capital U, boss universal. Man, if there is a devil, he seems to be running the whole show. That's what he's saying. And we see him get closed and closed and closed. And he says, he certainly had me. Felt like he was grasped by that evil. But, and this is what is going to open him up again. But my friend sat before me and made the point blank declaration that God had done for him what he could not do for himself. And that is God's business. God does for me, and God does, I don't want to say for us, but God does for me what I cannot do for myself. And what can I not do for myself? Well, let's starters, permanent contented sobriety. That's out of reach for somebody like me. God's doing the heavy lifting. And so what are the two things? So we're going to see him get opened up again. So what are the two things that opened him up? His experience and the experience of seeing a recovered member in front of him. That's what opens us up. I don't know about you, but what opened me up to the idea of a power greater than myself was you. You, happy and sober with the light on in your eyes, even on weekends. It took me a little while to believe y'all were doing it on weekends. I don't know why. I did go to meetings on weekends. But like that idea that you had something I did not have. You felt the way that I felt. You drank and used the way that I drank and used. You experienced these things that I experienced. And man, you were happy and sober at the same time. And it says his human will had failed. And that's important because if I have this illness, I am beyond human aid. Doctors had pronounced him incurable. Society was about to lock him up. Like myself, he had admitted complete defeat. I don't know about you. That sounds like a step one to me. Complete defeat. Then he had in effect been raised from the dead, suddenly, taken from the scrap heap to a level of life better than the best he had ever known, and a level of life better than the best I'd ever known. That's a spiritual awakening, but also asterisk fine print, it's a level of life, meaning way of life, which means I'm not done. I don't get to set it and forget it. I got to keep going. I got to keep doing. I got to keep working. But what we see is that same pattern, that hopelessness to hope. And I want to point about suddenly, and I don't want to trip out too much about suddenly. If it didn't happen in an instant for you, don't worry, but that suddenly tells me that it does not take long to get well. It does not take long to have this experience suddenly. I don't have to wait. He's 2 months sober and the light is on for him. And this is interesting Had this power originated in him? Was this his power? Obviously, it had not. There had been no more power in him. There was in me, and at that minute, and that was none at all. Bill Wilson's drinking gin. Abby Thatcher's 2 months sober, awakened. The light is on in his eyes. And he sees that Abby Thatcher does not have the power in the sense that it is not of him. He didn't do that, but there's a power working through him. He sees that this isn't about willpower. This is about gaining access to the power, a power, right? And says that floored me. That floored me, right? The example of a recovered member. That's what carries this message. It began to look as though religious people, right after all, he got blown wide open. Whoa, like what a change in, like, whoa. And the is that sort of like, man, there's some humility in, when we're judging from the gutter to admitting I could be wrong. But isn't that also the path that we have to take? Here was something at work in a human heart. What I want to point out is a lot of what happens here happens within and within my heart. On page 25, it talks about, that central fact of our lives today being the absolute certainty that our Creator has entered into our heart and lives in a way in which is indeed miraculous, our heart, and lives in a way in which is indeed miraculous. That one of the places in which God resides is within our heart. And which had done the impossible. If you're wondering what is impossible, permanent, contented sobriety, that is impossible. And that was what he saw before him. And it says, my ideas about miracles were drastically revised right then. Never mind the musty past. Never mind letting go of all that. Here sat a miracle directly across the kitchen table. He shouted great tidings. I want to point out, he wasn't shouting, but his deportment, how he was carrying himself, the light on in his eyes, that is what's doing the shouting. He wasn't, sometimes I joke with sponsees, listen, I get my big book hardcover so I can beat the willingness. I don't beat the willingness. It's not my job. That's alcoholism's job or addiction's job or whatever brings you to this all-inclusive study. But my job is to just be a demonstration. I look at it like I'm just here to be the lighthouse, I'm not the light. I'm just trying to let the light flow through me. And so it said, I saw that my friend was much more than inwardly reorganized. So this isn't a guy who did a little bit of anger management and he's a lot less angry. This is different. It says he was on different footing. His roots grasped new soil. New soil. The roots grasping new soil, that's what we're talking about, is at the depth of who he is. It's not just, okay, I'm a little less anxious. Okay, I'm a little less angry. Okay, I'm a little less self-pitying. No, the depth of who he is rooted and grounded in something different. That is the change that's on offer. And the change I want to point out, because sometimes when we talk about the changes, there's that fear that, like, who will I be? And who will I be is the best version of myself and who I always wanted to be, but knew I couldn't live up to. That's who I'll be. And it says, despite the living example of my friend, he's getting a little closed again. There remained in me the vestiges of my old prejudice. He's still prejudices. Is to prejudge, is to have judgment for something that I've not had experience with. That's what a prejudice is. So he's got these old ideas and the vestiges, they're hanging on. The word God still aroused a certain antipathy. That's that dislike or aversion, like, I'm not down with God. When the thought was expressed, there might be a God personal to me, that feeling was intensified. I didn't like the idea. I could go for such conceptions as capital C, capital I, creative intelligence, capital U, capital M, universal mind, or capital S, capital N, spirit of nature. But I resisted the thought of a czar, capital C, capital H, czar of the heavens, however loving his sway might be. A czar would be a king or a ruler, right? That bearded guy in the sky, that's not what he's open to. And he says, I have since talked with scores of men who felt the same way. My friend suggested what then seemed a novel idea. It seems like, what a funny idea. Like, okay. It says, why don't you choose your own conception of God? It's in italics. It's important. Drunks agreed to spend money on it. Why don't you choose your own conception of God? And that's why this is a spiritual program. So that statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I had lived and shivered many years. I stood in the sunlight at last. I just love the metaphor of God as light in this book, because light is not what I see. Light is the way in which I see, and I begin to see everything in a whole new way. And man, I don't know about you. I talk about being on the beam spiritually. When I'm on the beam spiritually, man, I know what it's like to be in that light and that sunlight. And I also know what it's like when I'm cut off and I can feel that coldness and that darkness. And says, he goes on to say, it was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. Nothing more was required of me to make my beginning. I saw that growth could start from that point. So you can make a little note that this little paragraph right here is Bill Wilson's second step. And I'm going to explain why it's his second step. But step 2 is a place of growth. Step 2 is the starting line of, or starting, those, if somebody's in a sprint, like those starting blocks, it's a starting block. And really of a marathon, a lifelong race, it's not the finish line. But I got tripped up and thought I had to arrive at step 2 and no God, and I didn't. And it says, I saw that growth could start from that point upon a foundation of complete willingness. And that's the foundation, willingness. It's all about my willingness. I might build what I saw in my friend. Would I have it? Of course I would. And so this is his second step. Step 2 says, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves, not even came to believe in. Oh, sorry, we're on page 12. So sorry. Page 12, it's not the bottom paragraph, but one up from the bottom. Absolutely. So he came to believe that a power greater than himself. It was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. Nothing more was required of me to make my beginning. That's step 2, part 1. Step 2, part 2. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. That power can relieve from me the insane thought that I have to take the first drink or the first drug or the first whatever brings you to this study, to relieve from me the mental obsession. And then he says, I might, upon this foundation of complete willingness, I might build what I saw in my friend. That's step 2, part 2. He believes that there is a power, and he believes that that power can restore him to sanity, relieve from him the mental obsession. And it goes on to say, thus I was convinced that God is concerned with us humans when we want him enough. What's the takeaway from that sentence? I need to seek. I need to build a relationship. I've heard people say, like, God's a gentleman, like, God's not going to go where he's not invited. And sometimes, around Halloween, it's like a vampire, because I guess vampires won't go if you don't invite them in. I don't know why I know that. But that's just a fun fact about vampires, a fictional character. Oh, not emotional vampires, actually. That's not true for them. Emotional vampires will go whether you invite them or not. Anywho, sorry, tangent, bringing it back. But that I need to invite and I need to seek God. And it says, at long last I saw, I felt, I believed. Scales of pride and prejudice fell from my eyes. A new world came into view. And Chuck Chamberlain has that book, A New Pair of Glasses. See, what happens is he's beginning to see the world as it really is. A new lens on this life. It says the real experience of my cathedral, or the real significance of my experience at the cathedral, burst upon me, referencing his experience on page 1 again. For a brief moment, I had needed and wanted God. There had been a humble willingness to have him with me, and he came. But soon the sense of his presence had been blotted out by worldly clamors, mostly those within myself. And so it had been ever since, how blind I had been. Now, when we're talking about those worldly clamors, mostly those within myself, That's why I have steps 4 through 9, because that's what I'm trying to do, is clear away those clamors inside of me that is blocking me off from this power. The fear, the self-centeredness, the selfishness, the resentments, the self-pity, the 100 forms of fear, self-delusion, self-seeking. Got to clear all of that away. And it's usually the stuff inside of me. I'm blocked within me from the stuff inside me that I'm holding on to, that I need to get free of, so that I can live in that conscious companionship, in that light, in that relation with a power greater than myself. And then, as we're going to leave it there, but when we pick up next week, we're going to see Bill Wilson take the rest of the steps, and we're going to see his spiritual awakening. Because I want to point out that that is the order. I work the steps, and then I have the spiritual awakening. So thank you all for being here with me, and I'll stop the recording, and we'll wrap it up with the Serenity Prayer.